welcome to the Marley Bird YouTube channel, brought to you by Red Heart Yarns. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make your very first pair of socks using double pointed needles. We are going to make this really great and simple sock recipe that I have written on my website, marleybird.com, and we will make it from the cuff of the sock working all the way down to the toe. This is part of the 2018 Spring Knit Along for Red Heart. So this particular sock series will be broken up into 6 different videos. Each video will walk you through each step of the sock, so that way you have time to complete that section before you move on to the next section of the sock. This should be a really fun series of videos, and I know many of you out there have requested this video so much, so hopefully I do it justice and I help you fall in love with double points and fall in love with making socks. So what do you need for this particular sock pattern? Let me show you that now. For this sock, you need 2 balls of Red Heart Chic Sheep by Marley Bird. This is 100% washable merino wool. It comes in 186 yards per ball of yarn, which means it's more than enough to make both the lady size and the men's size socks that we'll be doing during the knit along. This yarn comes in 24 brilliant colors. For this particular sock, I worked with just 1 color for both socks. If you wanted to do some color work, you absolutely could do that. All you would do is need to buy just some more yarn, whatever color you wanted to mix in. Along with the yarn, you will need a set of size 5 or 3.75 millimeter double pointed needles. Now you will need 5 needles, okay? I've written the instructions so that we are using a set of 5 needles, not just 4, okay? So you want to make sure that you get a set of 5. The last thing that you are going to need for this particular pattern is a bent tip tapestry needle and a removable stitch marker. The full list of all of the materials for this pattern is written in the video description box right down there below, along with a link to the free pattern. While you're down there, go ahead and smash that like button, as my kids say. Get the pattern for this first part of the sock. Join me back here with your materials, and I'm going to get you started on making your very first sock. I really hope you are as excited as I am to make your very first pair of socks. I do want to preface this video with the tools we are going to be using, the double pointed needles, can be a little bit tricky. But if you can give yourself some time, some patience, and just a little practice with them, you will learn that they are very manageable and easy to work with. But just like anything, you need to practice in order to get used to them. So don't give up at the very beginning. Don't give up even 30 minutes in if you can't get it right away. It will happen, so just give yourself a little leeway, and I know that you can do this, all right? And if you have any issues, don't be afraid to leave me a comment below, and I'll help you out as much as I can. So before we get started on double pointed needles, I want to show you the anatomy of a sock so you know exactly what we're working on for this video. Let's take a look at the sock I've already knit up. This portion up here is the cuff of the sock, and this is the portion you will create for this video. Once you've created the cuff of the sock, you move into the leg of the sock. And in this leg section, you can keep it in stockinette or you can put a pattern to those leg stitches. But we'll talk about that in next week's video. Once you get past the leg, it's time to prepare yourself for the heel. And the heel we will be using is a heel flap, okay? So we are going to do a heel flap. So we will create this section of the sock, and I'm going to show you how to make this really cool decorative heel. That just makes the thickness of the heel a little bit more dense, and it just gives it a little bit more visual appeal. Once you make the heel, the next section will be turning the heel, so that way you can have a 3-dimensional object. We're going to turn the heel, and then we'll work these stitches right here, which are the gusset. If you think of the instep of your foot, the gusset section is what allows that instep to actually fit into the sock, okay? So when we get to week 1, 2, 3, 4, we will turn the heel and work the gusset of the sock. Once you've worked the gusset of the sock, so let's say we're here to this point, you're now to the foot of the sock, okay? So we will work the foot of the sock, and then in the last week, we will do the toe of the sock. So that's how we are going to break this up into 6 weeks of instructions. One thing that I want to offer as a piece of advice is when you're knitting your sock up and you're working through each week's instructions, go ahead and finish the cuff on one set of needles. And as I mentioned earlier, get a second set of needles and make a second cuff. Then, as week 2 is completed, you can finish the leg of week 2 for sock 1 and finish the leg of week 2 for sock 2, so on and so forth for the following weeks. By doing this, this will help you combat the dreaded second sock syndrome. What is that, some of you might be asking? Well, it's all too often that you will finish your very first sock and then you're like, oh, I don't want to cast on for the next one. But if you're working both of them at the same time on 2 sets of needles, you really will finish both sets, both socks. Let's see, you'll finish the pair of socks by the end of this knit along, and you'll have an actual full pair, so you won't have to go back and make another sock after the first one's complete. Does that make sense? Now, do you have to do that? Absolutely not. You could just make one sock all the way through and then make the second sock after you finish the first one. I'm going to leave that totally up to you. The other thing I want to point out is, yes, we are using Chic Sheep yarn, which is a worsted weight yarn, and it does not have any nylon. But the reason I chose this yarn is because it has a really nice soft wool. It will be comfortable to knit with. It is a little bit bigger, meaning we don't have to use super small needles. So if this is the first time you've actually ventured into working with double points, we don't have to use almost like toothpicks to work with our socks. It's a good sock for you to get started on because you have fewer stitches to work with and a little bit more substantial fabric to be working with as you work around slightly bigger needles, which is really nice. And when I say bigger needles, because that's the next subject, these are not bigger needles than what you would use as far as making working with the yarn, but they're bigger needles than what you would typically use for sock knitting. What I mean is when you make socks, you want to make sure that your actual fabric, the fabric you're creating, is knit rather snug, really tight, okay? You want it to be nice and not have a lot of wiggle room. The more snug, the more tight your stitches are together, the longer wearing your socks will be because the stitches themselves will not have an opportunity to rub up against one another and wear out quicker, okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. So let me rephrase that one more time. When you knit socks, you want your fabric to be nice and tight or dense or not have any looseness to it. So you want to make sure that you're using needles that will get you a nice tight fabric, okay? So when we're using a worsted weight yarn, typically we would use anywhere from a 7 to a 10, but we are actually using a size 5 needle because we want our fabric to be a little bit tighter. When you're using sock yarn, you might use anywhere from a size 2 to a size 0 needle to knit your socks. You want your socks to be nice and tight in the fabric. Okay, those are the basics. Now let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to show you how to cast on to your double pointed needles using my really great no cuss cast on. That's right, no cuss cast on. Here we go. For the no cuss cast on, you want to use the long tail cast on method to cast on your stitches. I prefer to use a set of 5 double pointed needles. So when I cast on to my needles, I want to make sure I take whatever my cast on number is and divide it by 4 so I can equally divide those stitches among these needles. I will place a slip knot directly onto one of the needles, and then I will put that portion of stitches on this needle. So for example, for a sock, you might want to put on 12 stitches or 16 stitches, depending on the size you're making. I'm going to cast on 12 stitches, so I have 1 stitch on my needle, and I will do the long tail cast on for 12 more stitches. Once I get the number of stitches on my first needle, I'm ready to move on and put the same number of stitches on my next needle. I have this really great ridge right here on the bottom of my needle because of the long tail cast on. If I take my next needle and I rest it right up next to that ridge, okay, see how it's right up next to that ridge, and I extend it up ever so slightly, now my second needle just looks like it's an extension of my first needle, correct? I've also made sure that my tail or my long tail cast on is below both needles, like it is not between this needle, it's not over top of my second needle or anything, it's below. Now I can continue on doing my long tail cast on, but this time I will cast on to the second needle, and I'll make sure that this stitch butts up right next to that last stitch I did on the previous needle. Can you see that? So that stitch is right up next to that one. And I continue on. So for this example, I would go ahead and I would put 12 stitches. I want to point out that you'll notice I'm holding both needles together down here. I'm not separating them out. I'm not letting one just fall to the wayside. I'm holding on to both. And that's very important for what I want to show you to do. So make sure you have held on to both needles. Once you've completed the stitches on needle 2, you can see once again I have that nice little ridge. So I would grab my third needle, rest that right up next to that second needle, resting right on the ridge, a little bit extended, making sure that my long tail is coming from the bottom. See how it's not over top of that needle at all. And now I go ahead and I cast onto the third needle, making sure that first stitch is really close to that last stitch I did on the previous needle. That's very important. I'll go ahead and put my stitches onto this needle too. You'll notice I took a second there just to move up this needle a little bit to give myself more room. And you can do that, but I still have a hold of all 3 needles. Notice I haven't let go. Now remember, I'm working with a set of 5 needles, so I'm going to do 1 more needle here. Rest it right up next to that long tail cast on. Extend that up ever so slightly, making sure that my working yarn and my tail are below that next needle, and then I carry on casting on, making sure that first stitch is really close to the last stitch from the previous needle. Once you get the total number of stitches cast on to all of your needles, the next step is what makes this absolutely magical. I will take this set of needles, notice they're still in my hand, I'm holding on to all of them, and I want to place them down on the table just like so. And by doing this, it looks like I have this needle, that needle, that needle, that needle. If it were all just one needle, this line of stitches, they look like they're continuous without any gaps, without any spaces. And that's very important to make sure that we don't get any ladders right here from the very start. Now that we've cast on our stitches and all of our join points are really nice and snug, it's time to put our needles in the position so we can start working in the round. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim off any extra long tail I have here. And I'm just leaving about 5 to 6 inches. I'm going to get rid of that just so I don't accidentally knit with it. And here's the kicker. When you go to join these needles in the round, our ultimate goal here is to make this very first stitch we did meet up with this very last stitch we did. So that way, as the yarn comes from the very last stitch, we will knit into this first stitch, which will join the piece in the round. What we have to be careful of is that we don't twist our stitches. So this is how I ensure that I don't twist stitches. Part of the reason I made sure you held on to all of the needles is so that they weren't dangling around and accidentally getting twisted around and just getting out of shape for you. Because if you held on to them and you've placed them on the table like this and you do what I'm getting ready to show you to do, you'll have perfect join and a perfect non-twisted long tail cast on. You ready? I have my stitches down like this. I'm going to take the last needle I did, I'm just going to hold it in place. Okay, so I'm not going to let it go anywhere. I'm going to take these 3 needles and having the needles work on top of the next, I'm just going to turn all 3 of them. Can you see that? I'm going to move this right here so you can see here. I've just moved all 3 needles. Okay, now I'm going to hold the needle right here that I just turned. And I'm going to take these 2 needles and I'm going to have them rotate as well. Get the yarn out of the way for you. I'll have those rotate. Can you see that? Now I'll hold this 3rd needle and I'm going to take the very last one and I'm making sure that the needles are going on top of each other. You see that? And I'm just rotating. I now have a square that is perfect in that my last stitch now meets up with my first stitch ready to be knit. I have this really great ridge of pearls that I can see from using the long tail cast on. They're all on the inside of my circle, which is where I want them to be. I don't see any of them twisted around any of the needles. Perfect. That means I'm not twisted. I don't see any twist here at my join points, and that's because I held on to my needles all at the same time, and I made sure that that first stitch on the next needle always butted right up next to the last stitch I did on the previous needle. So now I have my needles set in a great position, ready to start working in the round. Now here's something that usually happens is you will pick up your needles at this point and they're a little bit fussy and fumbly and you start getting things out of shape, things get twisted, and that's when things start to mess up. So what I want you to do is this. We're going to take our needles and we're going to position them so that we are looking at it like so. And what's going to happen here is we're going to take our 5th needle now, and with the work on the table, I'm not going to pick it up off the table here to start. I'm going to take my 5th needle. I will stick it right into that last stitch. It's the first stitch we ever did, okay, right? But it was the one that we had come up and meet. So I'm putting it right in there, just as if I'm getting ready to knit it. You see that? Okay, hopefully you can see what I mean here. So I'm getting ready to knit that stitch. What I want to do is my yarn is coming from this needle over here, which is perfectly fine because as soon as I go to knit this next stitch, it's going to join to work in the round. So all I will do here is with my needles still on the table so that you can not have anything twisted, I will yarn over my needle I just stuck in and I will go ahead and work my knit stitch. So I yarned over, I pull out that stitch, and when I let that stitch jump off of my left hand needle, this is so important, you guys. Really pull that working yarn nice and snug. And then I want you to knit the next stitch and I want you to pull that working yarn nice and snug again. Okay, so I have 2 stitches there and they're pulled nice and snug. You'll notice now that I can pull up my needles and I don't have to worry about them getting twisted or anything because I've locked them into place just by knitting those first 2 stitches. I can go ahead, if you find that your needles are a little bit, like your stitches are all weighted on one side of the needle, you can position these so that the stitches are a little bit more centered and that will help you out. But now you have to find a rhythm, a balance, and it will be awkward. If you've never used double points before, it'll be awkward here at the start to ignore these extra needles that are just kind of hanging out there. But you really do just have to ignore them because you're still only knitting with this needle here, the 5th needle, and then the needle we just joined into. So I will go ahead, I'm going to knit all the way to the end of this needle. When I get to the end of the needle, what I like to do is I will position the stitches I just knit to the center of the needle they were just on. I rotate my work clockwise, and I begin my next needle here with the spare needle, and I will knit again. Now here's the biggest trick. When you knit this first stitch, really give it a pull. After you knit that stitch, you have to also knit the next stitch and give it a pull. By pulling those two stitches nice and snug, that's going to prevent you from getting ladders. I promise you. Once you've done those two stitches, you can go ahead and finish your row with just knits. I really like to knit the entire first round whenever I'm working with double pointed needles. I like the way it looks more than anything, but I also really like the way I have a little bit more fabric on my needles before I jump into my ribbing pattern or whatever it may be I'm jumping into. For these socks, I like to have one full round of just knits before I jump into my 1x1 ribbing. You'll notice there I moved my stitches to the middle of my needle, I rotated clockwise, and then I start my knitting again. And I'll knit the first one nice and tight, and knit the second one nice and tight, and then I just knit down to the end of this needle. When I get to the end of the needle, I'll have one more needle to work into before I get to the end of my round. And we're going to talk about how to know you're at the end of the round when I get there. Here I go. Move my stitches to the middle, rotate clockwise, and I'm to my last needle here, and I will start working into this one. Honestly, as you get past this first round, it becomes a lot easier. The first round is really tricky, and it's a little fiddly, and it's okay if you have to rip out and start this over even 15 times. That's totally okay. But just as long as you get comfortable with the joins and making sure that those first two stitches are nice and snug, that will really help you make sure that you get a really nice and beautiful sock, okay? So I'm at the end of my round, and one way that I know that is because I have come up to where my tail is. So my tail is attached to my last needle, okay? So if I wanted to use that as my my cue that I'm at my last needle, I could do that. But then remember at the start when I said you needed a stitch marker. This is another way that you could make sure that you are at the last needle. I'm actually going to have you place your stitch marker in the actual fabric and just have it lay there, okay? And I'm putting it on the stitches that are on my last needle, my needle 4. And what that will do is it's the big cue to you saying, oh, that's the end of my round. That will also be a clue to you that if this marker is ever on the inside of your work, say you're working along and it looks like it's on the inside of the work like this, you know you're knitting inside out. You always want to make sure that you are looking at the right side or the outside of your fabric. So as I'm knitting around, I always want to have this marker on the outside, okay? So that means my stitches are always over here as I'm knitting, and the stitches that are just being held by other double points are just resting over there. Once I finish this first round of just knits, I can go ahead and jump into my knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. So I will go ahead, knit this first stitch nice and snug, and I will purl the next stitch, make sure it's nice and snug, and then carry on. Knit and purl, knit and purl, all the way down to the end of this needle. You'll notice I'm not paying attention at all to the other needles that are just kind of hanging out there. For me, really, it's just like I absolutely ignore them. I'm only concerned with the 2 needles we're dealing with. I move my work to the center and turn and move those into place and begin knitting. As you keep these first 2 stitches nice and snug, you guys, that is what's going to really hold your needles into place. That's going to make it so that they don't fall out. If you find that your needles are falling out as you're working, 1, you are not knitting tight enough. You need to knit tighter. And 2, you need to make sure that those first 2 stitches are really nice and snug. If they're not nice and snug, your needles are going to fall out because your stitches are loose, and then you're also going to get some ladders, and you don't want those. So it's very important. You'll notice here I'm back to my last needle, and I know that because I can see my marker there. I also can see my tail, and I will go ahead and finish to the end of this row, or the end of this round, end of this needle. How many different ways can I say the same thing, right? And you'll notice by the time you get to the end of this round, it's starting to get a little bit easier. The stitches should be a little bit tighter. You have a little bit more fabric flowing from your needles themselves. And there we are. I'm to the end. Now, one thing I want to do is I'm going to put this down here. I want to point out you are always working with your work over here towards you. You never want to have your work over here away from you. Otherwise, you're working inside out. You also want to make sure you always have the right side of your fabric out here on the outside of your needles. The last thing I want to point out is that your work is going to flow down from your needles. It's going to flow down from your needles. So those are all things you want to make sure you're paying attention to, on top of making sure that your stitches are nice and snug. I want you to take a look here. Can you see how my stitches from one needle to the next are really nice and snug, and they almost look like they are seamless, or there's not even a break in them? That if you were to just put this out straight and flat, it would just like it was just flat knitting. It would look as if it was just flat, straight knitting without any break points. That's your ultimate goal. You want to make sure that this stitch from this needle and this stitch from this needle look like they are seamless. If one looks like it's a little bit larger or a little bit further away, you're gonna get ladders. That's what a ladder is, okay? It's that extra fabric that's created between the double points. Now, for your homework, I need you to finish the cuff. It's 1.5 inches for the 8-inch circumference size, and it's 2 inches for the 10-inch circumference size. Once you finish the cuff on one sock, that's where I highly encourage you to go ahead and cast on for a second sock and begin your cuff for that sock as well, so you can have both socks going at the very same time. It just will make things really nice and easy. Don't forget to keep those stitches nice and tight. Join us over on the Facebook group if you have any questions. I'd love to answer your questions over there. I'd like to see your works in progress. I'd like to see how everything's going for you. I'm really excited to have you get started on this journey. And again, be patient with yourself, especially if this is the first time you've ever used double points. It will all come together, but remember, we were all beginners at one point in time, and it does take some practice, and we'll get through this together, I promise. I'm Marley Bird, and this is the 2018 Spring Knit Along with Red Heart for My First Socks with Marley Bird, and I will see you next week with part 2 of the sock pattern. Thanks, guys. Don't forget to smash that like button. Bye. Everything you need to know about knitting or crochet can be found right here on the Marley Bird YouTube channel. Learn with Marley Bird. Visit youtube.com/Marley Bird.